Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So this is the former home of the late Jeremy Thorpe of happy though inglorious memory at Orme Square, London. It's number 1 right behind me. And Jeremy Thorpe is a figure who has scintillated me since my adolescence. I remember reading that in 1979 Eton held a survey before the parliamentary election, and it showed that Liberal support had collapsed at the school, despite Thorpe being an Old Etonian and leading the Liberals, the only party led by an Old Etonian at that time. And previously 2 of the 3 major parties had been led by them. And that was because of the Very English Scandal. If you've seen the film of that title or read the book of the title, which is factual but reads like a novel. It's because of Jeremy Thorpe having a fallout with his former gay lover who was embarrassing him, threatening to blackmail him, just a thorn in his side, constantly pestering him for years, that supposedly he couldn't get a national insurance card because of Jeremy Thorpe. Well, the whole thing goes back to 1961, when Thorpe began a relationship with Norman Josiffe, a male model and sometime working pupil at a stables. He didn't like to be called a stable boy, so Jeremy Thorpe, he'd been born in 1929, the son, indeed the grandson of Conservative MPs, and his grandfather had been a celebrated construction magnate and ardent imperialist, so much so he's known as Empire Jack. But all had gang awry for his father in the 1920s when he took on a huge construction project in Egypt, but turned out to have hugely underestimated his costs and looked like he was going to go bankrupt, so he committed suicide. Thorpe's other grandfather was a Church of Ireland clergyman who'd run Christ Church, Cork, and later been translated to a parish in England. Thorpe's father had gone to St John's School, Leatherhead, then the University of Manchester, was called to the bar, served in the Manchester Regiment of the First World War, married. Thorpe had 2 sisters, both older. Anyway, Thorpe's mother, she was really a conservative, a very formidable figure, a bit of a battle axe. I think very admirably portrayed in that biopic, A Very English Scandal. So Thorpe had gone to a prep school, I'm afraid I don't recall which, and he'd grown up in Kensington in a very privileged circumstances. His family knew David Lloyd George very closely, and so much so he actually considered Lloyd George his grandfather. He knew that Lloyd George was not his grandfather, the last Liberal Prime Minister, but when Michael Block wrote a splendid biography of Thorpe, and I've read it cover to cover several times, and one time Block asked Jeremy John Thorpe about his grandfather, and Thorpe immediately assumed this was a question about Lloyd George, even though it wasn't. Perhaps I think his maternal grandfather had died before Jeremy Thorpe was born. The other one, I'm not sure. So then the Second World War came. Thorpe was evacuated to the United States, and he lived with an affluent family over there who were Republican supporters, and he was not of a right-wing inclination. He came back and he went to Eton in 1944. Because the war was not quite over, but the threat of invasion had passed, and he left in 1947. He only spent 2.5 years at Eton. He was a gifted violinist, wasn't so much into sports. He began to dabble in homosexual relationships. Until the 70s, these things happened actually quite openly at Eton. Bizarrely, as society became more accepting, Eton became much more homophobic. So homosexual acts were illegal at any age until 1967, but although these things were quietly tolerated in intellectual and theatrical circles, and yes, it went on public school sometimes, but people were expected to grow out of it when they left school and they began to meet the opposite sex. Anyway, so then he left school. He worked for a term teaching in a prep school. You could do that without any qualifications whatsoever in those days. And then there was national service, as in all boys had to do 2 years in the armed forces. So he did his basic training. He was sent to Portadown, Northern Ireland, to do some non-commissioned officer training, which was thought to be unimpressive for an Etonian, should be going for officer training. But he had petit mal epilepsy, and then he supposedly staged a blackout, pretending to have a severe epileptic fit when he really didn't have epilepsy that badly, and therefore was invalided out, was able to go to university that October instead of 2 years later. And I've heard people say that he deliberately wet his bed as well, because then they think he's kind of unsuitable material. But it worked for him. So he's reading jurisprudence at Oxford, at Trinity College, Oxford. He already decided he was a Liberal, which was a brave and eccentric choice. Of the 650 MPs in Parliament, only a dozen were Liberals, which is their current strength, by a curious coincidence. And then he didn't do terribly well at law. He was a good friend of George Carman, who was a stellar law student. but Thorpe cut his teeth at the Oxford Union Society, which was the debating society of Oxford University, and was elected president thereof. Liberals seemed to dominate it then. He had other Liberal friends like Robin Day, later a famous broadcaster, who was also very involved in the Oxford Union Society, and he was active in the Liberal Party. In 1950, there's 51, there's a very close election result. And Churchill offered the Liberals, would they like to form a coalition with the Conservatives? But Thorpe and other Oxonian Liberals wrote to Churchill, to the Liberal leader. Oh my God, what was his name? He's Welsh, Sir Clement Davies, and prevailed upon him not to do so, feeling it would split the party between left and right wings, and the Liberals would no longer have a distinct identity. The National Liberals would already been effectively absorbed into the Conservative Unionist Party by that stage. Anyway, that succeeded. So this campaigning in the 1950s. If they got a third-in-law who was called to the bar, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. Don't mean it's difficult, I mean it's actually impossible. It's against the rules these days. So, and then he practiced in a desultory fashion. He was campaigning for the Liberals. He stood in Devon North in 1955 and made some progress. In 1959, he actually managed to win a seat in Parliament. There were only 6 Liberal MPs. So it was a very courageous choice. This was a David against the Goliath struggle. But it was easy to be a big fish in such a small pond. And he was also working as an interviewer of the BBC as well, travelling around the world. He sympathised with the anti-colonial movement and indeed the anti-apartheid movement. So he's getting quite well known. So he dabbled in, he was still having homosexual relations, but he never seemed to have a lover. I mean, someone he actually loved. He just had these unserious encounters. Anyway, he met that Norman Josiffe, but perhaps it was serious to Joseph, according to him, his first gay relationship. But it seems to have been solely a physical thing from Jeremy Thorpe's perspective. But he was obviously feasting with panthers, as Oscar Wilde would have called it. Well, it was playing with fire, because if he was ever caught, that would be the end of his political career. Plus, I mean, it could be prison time as well in those days. Anyway, so then he was elected leader of the Liberal Party in 1965, and he decided he needed to get married. So he had to marry a naive young lady, Caroline Allpass, who he thought wouldn't know anything about homosexuality. He wasn't sure that he could bring himself to have intercourse with a female, though he did manage it, and their child was born, who's now a photographer. Their child's the one who took those photos of Catherine Zeta-Jones's wedding to Michael Douglas without their say-so. It was a big hoo-ha in about 2002. And what's the next thing? So they did quite well in the 1970 election, but just after that, Jeremy Thorpe's wife, Caroline Allpass, she was killed in a car accident. So it was a very heavy blow to him, because although he'd married for entirely cynical reasons, for presentational reasons, he had actually come to love his wife. And being uxorious, this bereavement was something which hit him hard. But a couple of years later, he met the Countess of Harewood, who'd come to the United Kingdom as a teenage refugee. She was a Viennese Jewess. She'd married the Queen's cousin, had 3 sons with him, but divorced him over his adultery. So he married Lady Harewood. She was 2 years older than him. It was too late for more children for her, and she brought this house as part of her alimony. And there's a famous scene of them on that balcony over there, waving to the adoring multitudes after his acquittal. Well, fast forward, I mean, that Joseph, or Norman Scott, whatever his name was just a problem that refused to go away. Thorpe plotted murder. He had a donation of £10,000 from Jack Hayward, this British businessman resident in the Bahamas, and for the forever cash-strapped Liberal Party, £10,000 was manna from heaven. Remember, in the early 70s, £10,000 was worth far more than it is today. But anyway, he engaged a hitman. Thorpe engaged a hitman to try and kill Norman Scott, because after over 10 years, he was still being pestered by Scott, and payoffs and attempts to get him jobs just didn't work. Peter Bessel was his point man on this one. So Andrew Newton eventually would try to kill Norman Scott, went down to Devon, found him, befriended him, said, "I've been paid to protect you." Eventually persuaded him to go on a drive across the moors one storm-tossed and rainy October night in 1975, and stopping the car. Newton was driving, said, "Get out, can you take over the driving?" So Norman Scott gets out, so did his Great Dane Rinker. At that point, Andrew Newton shoots dead the Great Dane, turns the gun on Scott and says, "And now it's your turn." But the gun jams. So then Scott ran off shrieking into